kind of have been making me rethink about my work on the climate, the physical climate of the Sahel, and climate change in the Sahel, and what it means in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So these are the ideas that I would like to discuss with you, present you, and so that we can have a discussion. And hopefully this is just the beginning of a lot of collaborative work. And so I gave this the title, The Long-Term View on the Sahel, and because I wanted us to think of the Sahel not as the Sahel is so often talked about as the locus of crisis, and I kind of wanted to get beyond that. But as I was thinking and rethinking also, this is definitely nothing as ambitious as what maybe some of you know as the West African long-term perspective study of about 20 years ago. It's very much climate change, climate science, climate change policy centered line of thought that I would like to share with you. So, oops, what's happening now? How do I move the slides? This is an interesting technical challenge now. Oh, let me see. You can see the slide has moved, yes? So
yes, absolutely.
I'm assuming, yeah. Okay, great. So this is one of the ways in which, well, this is one of the crisis narratives, if you wish, that the Sahel is famous for. It has to do with drought and food security or food insecurity, or more generally now, food insecurity. And since the droughts of the 70s and 80s, there has been a lot of development in monitoring and trying to predict and mitigate food insecurity. And so the Sahel used to be seen as crisis related to food insecurity. And so, and this is work, these are processes that are ongoing. What you see on the screen now are maps of where the food insecurity is, where the concerns in food security are currently, and for the recent future. And so the yellow and the orange is where the concern is. And interestingly, still just staying for another minute on this crisis narrative, if I move my mouse, do you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Right, okay, great. So the crisis, as many of you who follow the news, is centered around the border between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and then northeastern Nigeria. And so it's not even not necessarily a climate crisis anymore, as most of you will know. Now we talk about the Sahel when we talk about conflict and terrorism. Okay, this is what I don't want to talk about for the rest of our time together. So, and so what I would really like to do is share a bit of an alternative narrative on the Sahel, and maybe in a way practical, maybe a bit utopian, but in any way, a different way of looking at this region. And so here, one way to see an alternative Sahel, it just happened to me that I participated in another one of these Macron showings of international cooperation and interest. What is this process called the Paris Peace Forum? And I was invited by a colleague who works on actually works on climate, food security, and resilience. And there I found myself. So this was hosted at this La Grande Halle de la Villette, which is a big space, and it was a showcase about projects that had been selected around these different topics that you see here: culture and education, environment, and so on. And so there are projects that were being brought by international organizations, NGOs, and civil society. And it just so happened that so many of them had the Sahel or some geographical region of the Sahel as their focus. And so I thought, wow, what an interesting difference. There is something else on the ground that is alive and kicking, and that perhaps deserves more attention that we give it. And so what can we also do as researchers and academics in regards to all this that's bubbling up from the ground, let's say. So this up to here in the way of motivation. So I'll just briefly describe what the Sahel is to me as a climate scientist. And so it's this long, narrow strip of land across Africa between the desert to the north and the savanna to the south. And here it's characterized in terms of land cover as shrubland, grassland, cropland. And climatically, it's between these two thin black lines that denote climatological rainfall of 400 to 800 millimeters per year. So this is our Sahel really, and it really goes across from, let's say, Senegal to Sudan and Ethiopia, if you like. And it's semi-arid, and it has one rainy season and a very, very variable climate. Okay, so now that I've kind of given you a few slides of motivation of what this will not or will be about, these are the three elements I would like to discuss. So I'll give you a very brief rundown of how we understand the climate of the Sahel based on how we understand how it varied throughout the 20th century. And then I will want to talk a bit about adaptation and mitigation, which are the two elements of climate policy around climate change. Okay, and the reason why I'm doing this again is that it's kind of, I know that there's quite a number of my colleagues in New York, so I hope they'll bear with me if I repeat some things they're already very familiar with. But my intent was also to share, to kind of introduce myself to the community here in Paris and perhaps elsewhere. And so share a bit of where I come from and the work I've done and in climate science, but also a little bit dabbling into interdisciplinary research around adaptation especially. And then here and there intersperse some field notes because working at IRI is actually giving me the unique opportunity to not just do climate science in front of a computer, but also connect that climate science to experiences on the ground and to places where the science can be used to inform decisions. And so there's a practical, also interdisciplinary research agenda that I hope we'll have the opportunity to discuss in greater detail following up on this. Okay, so just I think it's like 3-4 slides on climate science. How did I get into this? So I actually, if you allow me to tell very briefly a story. So I was in graduate school at Columbia in the late 90s, but in graduate school, my PhD advisor actually advised me to stay away from trying to figure out this question of what caused drought in the Sahel, because he didn't think that climate models were up to par at that point. And so there's also an underlying story here about how climate models have developed in the 20 years since that maybe we can touch on as I go along. But so 20 years ago, and to some extent you will also perhaps note that it's actually beyond the science. It's still very much a discussion around the causes. There's still a lot of debate and discussion around the causes of drought in the Sahel in the 70s and 80s. But in any case, in the early 2000s there were two alternative hypotheses as to what had caused persistence of drought in the Sahel, and that this persistent drought that then caused at times famine and food insecurity. And one was related to local processes that triggered desertification, and the other one connected the Sahel to the global climate system. And you see some of the detail there, but I won't go into too much detail. So this is where I found myself after graduate school, when I was a postdoc at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And so in the early 2000s, using climate models, I was actually able to show that the second hypothesis hypothesis was right. And so that the oceans were the dominant influence on the climate of the Sahel. And so how did I do this? I analyzed simulations with climate models where what's modeled is the global atmosphere in this case, and then the information that's fed into the model. So what the modeled atmosphere sees is actually what was observed in terms of sea surface temperature. So in terms of the boundary conditions at the ocean for almost the entire century, from 1930 to 2000. So given only knowledge of the sea surface temperatures as they evolved in the real world, this model was able to reproduce the ups and downs of rainfall in the Sahel. And so here the red curve is what was observed. And so what you see is that if you're above zero, it means it rains more than usual. And obviously if you're below, it means it rains less than usual. And so here in the red is what's very characteristic of any time series of any meteorological station pretty much across the Sahel. The 50s and 60s were actually abundant. And then there was this decline into the early 70s and 80s with really the driest years in 72, 73, and then 82, 83, and 84. Okay, so the models being able to reproduce this when they only had information about sea surface temperatures, they knew nothing about land use or land cover change, meant that really it was the oceans that did this. And so it was really a much larger scale climatic shift. And I know that I probably shouldn't do this, but if you have any pressing questions, maybe I can stop right after the end of this little science discussion, and then I don't know, or maybe we should wait until the end, I don't know. But in any case, so these really were, so this is the short story about what caused droughts. So it was oceans, not land use change. And the second element of this, and this also speaks to the evolution in climate models, in that in this previous slide I had an observed ocean. I fed the people who made these simulations fed the ocean as it had been observed over the 20th century to get an atmospheric model to respond, a model atmosphere to respond. Here we're in the realm of coupled ocean atmosphere models, the ones that are used by IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to simulate past and future climates. And when we looked at the end of the 20th century, so this drought period in these models, so here now we have many models and they're somewhat more complex than the previous one. And what we noticed here in the bottom panel here, this is how surface temperature changed in the models as a consequence of what in IPCC speak are called the natural and anthropogenic forcings, meaning natural forcings change the radiative balance of the planet. So anything that changes how much energy is coming into the planet is prescribed here. And then a coupled ocean atmosphere system is let go and evolves. So in response to these natural and anthropogenic forcings, at the end of the 20th century, you had a warmer tropical oceans in this red box. You had a lot of warming of the oceans, but notably, you didn't have much of a warming in the North Atlantic. And so this pattern of warming everywhere except the North Atlantic in these models goes along with drying of the Sahel. And actually this whole blue all across the Atlantic means really a drying, really a widespread drying, a decrease in precipitation all across this tropical Atlantic belt from the Caribbean to Ethiopia. And yeah, so the forcings here, so what causes some of these changes here, it's everything. It can be changes in insolation, it can be volcanic aerosols, those are what we call natural forcings. And then it can be anthropogenic, human forcings like greenhouse gases and aerosols, pollution. Okay, and so the way to tie this to Sahel rainfall is to think that, for example, greenhouse gases could be responsible for this wholesale warming, which includes the tropical oceans. And that in fact, this warming hole in the North Atlantic can be attributed, we say in climate speak, to the fact that sulfate aerosols from pollution actually shielded the surface of the oceans from insolation, because sulfate aerosols reflect the insolation that's coming in, and so produced a relative cooling of the ocean. But without getting into too much detail, these are the two elements that we think can explain how the oceans affect Sahel rainfall. And this more generally, I mean, I just gave you an attribution argument but the underlying argument can be made in general terms, in this comparison of how does the temperature of the North Atlantic change in relation to the global tropical temperature. So fast forward to the most recent generation of models, then you can see, what I want to show you here is that the red curve here, Emmanuel, can you hear? I just got one of these messages that say that my connection is unstable.
I can hear you quite well. I think if you,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can hear you quite distinctly, but if anyone can't hear Alessandra, please let me know through the chat box. And again, if you have questions as well for Alessandra, please use the chat box and I'd be happy to convey them. I see somebody else, Franco is also replying that he can hear you fine.
Okay,
might be a question of connection. If you can't hear Alessandra well, might be worth your while reconnecting. So leaving the meeting and then reconnecting.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you for monitoring this. So I think this is the last one of the science slides. What I'm showing you here is the red curve again is a curve of how the Sahel rainfall vary in observations. And so what you can see again, it's a little longer than the previous one. It extends to 1900, but you can see again a period of abundant rains in the 50s and 60s, and then the decline in the droughts of the 70s and 80s. The thinner green curves are 29 models now, so 29 of the models that participated in CMIP 5 in the 5th assessment report for IPCC. And the yellow line is the multi-model mean. So if I take the average of all these models, then what I'm trying to show you here is that actually these models reproduce the drying of the Sahel, and they actually start the drying earlier, in the 50s even, and then they reproduce some of these driest years, especially the one that's really the most striking one is 1982, which was a dry year in observations. And here the most plausible reason that these models all catch this is that this was actually the impact of a volcanic eruption in 82. And so a volcanic eruption that in some ways works in a way similar to sulfate aerosols. It shields the surface from insolation, and so by that mean it cools it. And so here, what happens with volcanic eruptions depends on whether they shield more the north or the southern hemisphere. And in this case, the northern hemisphere cooled more than the southern hemisphere. So again, we were in a situation that was unfavorable for Sahel rainfall. But besides the one-off volcano, the idea again here is that it was a combination of greenhouse gases and aerosols that affected ocean temperatures that affected Sahel rainfall. So this is what's, the germs of what's called attribution. So attributing Sahel droughts to aerosols and greenhouse gases. But I want to end this climate science part by actually highlighting the fact that from the driest 1980s now, the models agree with observations that there's an upward trend. And in this context of thinking of what the influence of emissions could be, this is understood in terms of a reduction in aerosols that was brought about by the Clean Air Act and similar legislation over North America and in Europe that reduced that pollution of sulfate aerosols that then cooled the North Atlantic. So even though there was an element of greenhouse gases and global warming in the drought, this past epoch, the future doesn't need to be like this past epoch because this pollution by aerosols actually played a very specific and unique role. And that is not the direction that emissions are taking now. Yeah, so the fact that drought is relatable in part to warming doesn't mean that future warming will also enhance or worsen drought. And you can clearly see that in this upswing here at the end of the 20th century. Okay, so in terms of climate science, then these are some of the talking points you could, if I could summarize. So the oceans played the dominant role. Land use is a feedback, but it's a feedback to, or land-atmosphere interaction in general is a feedback to oceanic influence. But it's not as strong as the influence of the oceans. They're just different scales. The fact that rainfall is sensitive to oceans actually makes seasonal prediction feasible, because seasonal prediction is predicated on the oceans evolving more slowly and then dictating then outcomes in places that are sensitive to their variations, like the Sahel. And we can build an attribution argument that attributes at least partially the Sahelian droughts of the 70s and 80s to human emissions by way of the oceans. So the argument that I made briefly here is one that goes from human emissions to changes in the ocean. Okay. Yeah.
Great.
Okay, so now one first lesson learned about in talking about climate change and in kind of going beyond academia was one that I learned here in this context. I was on the side of a conference in Senegal. We visited some sites where there were some, let's say, environmental restoration projects going on. And this specific one had to do with the fact that this region in central western Senegal, around Kaolack, there's an issue with salinity in the ground or in the fields. And so here they were applying peanut shells that would suck out the salt and then and so to overcome this problem. But this lady here was the leader of a women's group, and at some point the gentleman on the right said, okay, you climate scientists, come and talk about climate to these ladies. But then he whispered in my ear, and please don't say anything too negative, you know. And so it kind of gave me a different, you're on the ground there. You have to say things that are useful and practical. You have your chance to say, to share a bit of what you learned, and at the same time, you want to give a practical perspective to things. So it was a useful lesson for me to learn. So, okay, now second part, adaptation. So what I put in gray here, short-term seasonal prediction, I'm going to gloss over, but if you have questions, we can discuss this in more detail. This is a lot of what IRI does, and the reason why I delved into trying to understand the causes of drought is that you want to understand the causes to be able to then predict and then have more confidence in the predictions that are made. But what I want to talk more about is actually, what did we learn from coping with drought? What lessons were learned in the Sahel in the 30, 40 years of coping with droughts that could be put to use to adapt into climate change? Oh, so, okay, this is the only slide I have about seasonal predictions, actually, because seasonal predictions, and then there's a whole process around them, especially in Africa. There are regional processes where these predictions are discussed that are actually also a great venue to understand what the role of science and research is and how it can be applied, and also just to share, again, knowledge in all possible ways. And so I was lucky to participate in a few of these, and these are the usual awful pictures that we bring back to our communications team from these kinds of field work venues that we engage in. And so it was the Seasonal Climate Outlook Forum for the Sahel of a few years ago. And in fact, I just wanted to note that the Climate Outlook Forum for this year, you see, because the rainy season in the Sahel is July to September, predictions are discussed ahead of the rainy season. So typically they're discussed in April, May. And in fact, the Climate Outlook Forum is going on this week, but it's going on virtually also. So it's online, and I'm looking forward to actually engaging in some discussions in the remainder of the week. Okay, so adaptation. So then going back to this big, long-standing discussion about drought, desertification, climate change, then actually, even though the association between land use and desertification and drought was proven to be secondary, in the intervening decades since the droughts in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of interesting good work that went on both in research in academia and on the ground. And there's a big effort, I think, in interdisciplinary research in this respect, in trying to connect actually what are very large scale assessments of how the environment changes to then local assessments of what's happening that's making that environmental change. So satellites that observed land cover were put up in the early 80s, and then everybody was expecting that they would see desertification, and when they had enough, a long enough record. And in fact, what happened even starting from the early 90s and then into the early 2000s is what came up was really surprising, was a greening trend in the Sahel. So a trend towards an increase in vegetation cover. And that's what's plotted in all this green across the region in this top panel. And then what's interesting here is that then there are some attempts to try and separate what may have been actually caused by the recovery of precipitation. So the fact that the early 1980s, when these records started, were the driest years. And so any time series that you look at that starts in the early 80s, whether it's any precipitation time series, you know that if it starts in the early 80s in the Sahel, it will go up, it will have a positive trend. And so if there's a matching trend in vegetation cover, then you're likely to just conclude that that's it. There's more vegetation because it's raining more than in the drought periods. And so people have been trying to disentangle these two things in different ways. And so the bottom panel here is one way to try and separate and look at what's left over once this relationship between precipitation and vegetation is taken out of the picture. And so when you do that, when you look at the residual, then you see that there are places that are still green, despite, independent of rainfall. For example, I'm going to point out these places in northern Burkina Faso, some places here in southern Niger, and then there's more everywhere. But there's also some places that are actually where there seems to be some degradation here in these pink shades. Now on the ground, if you connect that, if you really go local village level, then we know that there are different kinds of things that happened, interventions that were put in place to try and reduce land degradation or desertification. And what really spread widely, for example, across northern Burkina Faso is are all manners of techniques that are called soil and water conservation. So what you see here in these three panels are different land uses, and let me see. So yellow is cultivation, so agriculture. This pinkish is really bare soil, so this is where the degradation is. And then where it's hatched is soil and water conservation treatment. Where was that put in place? So you see that there's a little bit of it put in place in this 1984 map here in the right of the panel. And there's a lot more in 2002. And at the same time, you see that there's a reduction in these pink areas and a lot more cultivation. So some reappropriation then of land that used to be degraded, and thanks to these kinds of interventions is no longer degraded, has been restored. The other kind of intervention is agroforestry. And so here are two aerial photographs of somewhere in southern Niger, and you see that actually the tree cover in 2005 is much more extensive than in 1975. Okay, now I realize I should be speeding up a bit. But so this makes for an interesting, like I was saying, an interesting, really interdisciplinary research project, in the sense that how do we connect what satellites see with what's going on the ground? And so we tried this in this, and this map is trying to show that it's a slightly different way of trying to deconvolve this precipitation vegetation signal that points to some of these same regions as places where there may be regreening, but not because rainfall has increased. And so in terms of adapting to climate change also, the idea then is that some of these soil and water conservation or agroforestry, or these techniques that come from local knowledge of how to manage the environment, may actually be useful when couched in terms of adapting to climate change, because they make more efficient use of rains. So if you're comparing that to the fact that we may be going in the direction of more variable rainfall on all time scales, from intraseasonal to multi-decadal, then being able to make more efficient use of rain, reduce runoff, and favor infiltration should all be useful techniques to some extent to reduce the impact, the vulnerability to rainfall variability. And so this, you kind of, if you have an eye for it, you see this everywhere they take you across the Sahel. So this was in that same field trip, someplace, again, inland from Dakar. And these, with the stones that you see here are stone contours, and they're put in along contour lines of topography, so that they reduce runoff. They block runoff if there's any runoff, and try to reduce it, so that you reduce little by little. You try to reduce this degradation that you see, this soil erosion that you see below. And I mean, I had the good fortune of seeing a lot of that in this other place in northern Ethiopia. That's really, one of the very well-known place where a lot of these efforts actually bore fruits in terms of making rural livelihood somewhat more resilient to climate variability. Okay, maybe I'll skip this slide of questions, but there's a lot of interdisciplinary research questions that really require that climate scientists to talk to other scientists and to practitioners to really get to the bottom and understand how climate through and human agency and all that in the broader socio-economic environmental context affects things. We really need to understand the complexity of things, and not just how climate may be changing, but also where the sensitivities and the exposures are, to understand, for example, something like food security, or where World Food Program may want to intervene to stave off food security crisis. Okay, so let me try somewhat briefly now to this is really something I would like to discuss, because it's something I've not at all worked on, but I would really like if there's anybody who is interested or who can give me some good advice on where to take this. This is what, you know, what I started thinking of when I moved to Paris, and at the same time IPCC came out with this report that said if we really want to, you know, reduce the impact of climate change and really reduce the warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, because we think that if we go beyond that, it's really going to be irreversible changes, then we have 20 years to do that. And so this is some of my thinking of how this applies to the Sahel. And granted, I mean, I'm really looking forward to your advice, because I realize myself it's naive, because but I want to still put it out there, because I think we need to think about it more collectively and from different points of view of different disciplines. So if you look at why should the Sahel even bother about contributing to mitigation, right? The Sahel is somewhere in here. So the size of the bubbles here is you know, the amount of emissions that of CO2 emissions that each country spews into the atmosphere. And the Sahel is in these little bubbles here. The biggest one is Nigeria, this one here. So clearly it's been contributing close to nothing in terms of emissions. And these are some numbers that I drew from an IEA report on CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. And I just put population here, just, you know, just to give some context. These are the population sizes for a handful of Sahelian countries, the percent of population that's urban, because it's really interesting in that it's varied, and also kind of tries to go along against the grain of thinking that all Sahelians are peasants or farmers or pastoralists. It's not necessarily the case. But here is what, you know, a typical Sahelian person emits compared to what we emit. This is in tons of CO2. So fractions of 1 ton, where we are in Europe, we're at 7, in the US, we're at 15, and so on. And so the total emitted by each country is this much. So clearly the Sahel is not emitting much, so should it take part in mitigating? And what angle can we, what's the perspective to look at this? You know, on the one hand, I mean, maybe the Sahel, from a climate science perspective, and thinking of what climate change has already meant for the region, then perhaps one could generically say, well, yeah, it would be in the Sahel's best interest to mitigate, because it is sensitive to climate change on any time scale. And so if more emissions mean more change, more variability, then that's possibly not a positive outcome for the region. So we should mitigate for that reason. But I would like to try and advance another reason and perspective that actually has potentially a large long-term benefit also to the region as it develops. And so that is to try and think of what policy tools do we have to ensure that the Sahel takes advantage of contributing to mitigation, so that it really transitions to what in Ethiopia they call a climate resilient green economy. So just sidesteps that step in development that relies on fossil fuels and just moves on to a climate resilient green economy. And so the reason that this thinking is that there's an urgency to do that if we really have we really only have 20 years to go carbon neutral, then because this is what we've put in the atmosphere already, and the carbon budget says that if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees, we have this much more to put in. And so when do we reach that? When do we top this off? You know, when do we exhaust our credits in terms of carbon budget? It's since the world is emitting 42 gigatons every year or something like that, you know, we have something of the order of 10, 20 years. And so then the slide here tries to make the point that if in fact the Sahel emitted, you know, this handful of countries in the Sahel emitted more like, not even Europe here, but let's say something more like the world average, then they would be making this contribution to the total budget, an annual contribution of, let's say, 2 gigatons to a carbon budget that annually is 32 gigatons. So it's not huge, but if they, you know, and I'm saying this, if they emitted this much because they developed using fossil fuels, then it wouldn't be a huge contribution, but it still wouldn't be negligible in my, from my point of view, in comparison to what Europe or the US are emitting. But perhaps more importantly, if we really have to go carbon neutral in 10, 20 years, then what's the point of building infrastructure, that building the necessary energy infrastructure so that these countries can really fully develop based on fossil fuels? Shouldn't, what kind of arguments? So that's where I'm going to leave it with you. It's like, what kind of arguments based on science, based on policy, can we build? Can we build arguments that kind of facilitate this transition to renewable energy, to low carbon emission future for the Sahel? And what's needed to do that? And in my view, it's not only research, but also education and engaging with civil society. And yeah, thank you. I think this is it. Yeah. Thank you so much. I apologize if I went a bit over my time.
No worries. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alessandra. And thank you for a very enlightening presentation. I would like perhaps to ask Richard Balm to perhaps kick off, say a few words and then kick off the Q&A period. Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I sincerely apologize for joining the meeting a little bit too late to be able to introduce Alessandra as we had agreed. But it's really a pleasure to have you all in the discussion. This is I'm really happy that we could arrange this seminar despite adverse circumstances between Columbia, Polytechnique, Paris, and Sciences Po. And the seminar is actually hosted within a seminar series at Sciences Po, which is called the Atelier interdisciplinaire de recherche sur l'environnement, the interdisciplinary workshop, research workshop on the environment that we launched a couple of years ago to create synergies between the different labs and research centers of Sciences Po developing research in this area. So thank you so much, Alessandra, for this presentation. It's the first time within AIRE we have a topic addressing Africa, and I'm particularly happy with this. I must say that I checked before the presentation a couple of your publications, and I tried to build up my understanding and knowledge of what climate scientists are doing, and I find it very, very impressive and very high quality. And you know, as you are here at Polytechnique as part of the Emmanuel Macron make our planet great again, I think it's what it's called.
Yes.
It's a wonderful opportunity to have you here, and I'm happy to host you in Sciences Po for this talk. Maybe to kick off the discussion, I know many of you have questions. I don't want to be long, but I was particularly to stay on the ground of social science, and where of course I'm a little bit more familiar than with climate science. I was very fascinated with the pictures you showed of your fieldwork. And to kick off the discussion and to start the discussion, you invite us to conduct on policy advocacy and policy integration, policy and science integration. I would like to ask you, Alessandra, with such an experience, what would be your comment on the relationship you develop with people on the ground when you do your fieldwork? You indicated a few things, saying, you know, this official asking you not to be too critical and to send too bad messages to people. But do you feel you can develop as a scientist a properly collaborative relationship with people in order to get them into some form of policy or at least action regarding climate change?
Thank you, Vishal. And first of all, let me thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Yeah, your curiosity and your openness to allow me to discuss this with you. Yes, I think it's, I mean, I've always found it very, you know, like throughout my career, so to speak, I've really cherished these opportunities to build connections, because I think it is vital to raise the legitimacy of this research and the science that we do, that we have these exchanges, and that they're never one way. You know, we always learn. I'm trying to, how do I do? Oh, show my face since I see you there. I think it's really capital to engage this way. You always come out learning so much more, but it's also essential because, you know, even, you know, because you're talking and you're engaging with your peer scientists in the country, and I do this because I think they are the ones who should really, who should have more of a say of what's going on in their country. And so if we engage and we exchange this knowledge, that's always going two ways, because you're bringing your understanding, but at the same time you're also learning about their perspective and perhaps what other research they may be, you know, or what other questions you should be asking. But I think it raises the legitimacy of the science if you're able to exchange this way. And then it's, you know, part of it is really just even research collaboration. Then there the issues are more, you know, where are we in terms of funding research across borders, so that it's really peer-to-peer and that everybody can engage at the same level, and and really put their hearts into a project when we're all kind of pulled in all different directions in our work. I don't know if that begins to answer your question.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think Emmanuel should take the lead in moderating the discussion, and maybe give the floor to our participants.
Sure. I thank you again, and thank you, Richard, for this. I know that Alex de Sherbinen needs to leave soon. So, Alex, if you're still with us, I'd like you to ask your question first, and then we'll go in the order in which we received all the other questions. Alex, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks. It's in the chat, but I'll maybe Ali, you've already seen it. But given that temperatures are going to rise in no matter what rainfall trends there are, we'll undoubtedly see a increase in temperatures, which increases potential evapotranspiration, which then could cause stress on plant growth. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are beyond sort of the tree planting, which obviously is really critical and important throughout the region, but also, you know, what other strategies might be taken. I don't even know, frankly, and maybe you're plugged into this more than I am, if CGIAR or other groups are already working on, say, temperature resistant strains of millet or sorghum or other staple crops for the region. So I just wondered if you could give us an update. And then unfortunately, I have to step off because I have another call at noon here.
Well, yeah, thank you, Alex. Thanks for participating, first of all. I think maybe that's a research question that we should pose at that level of the field to understand, in the presence of some of these adaptation strategies, whether temperature increases in temperature will really have that effect that we see, or we think that models show us that they will or not. Or I really don't know. I mean, for sure, I don't want to downplay the fact that this is already a pretty warm region climatologically, and so that increases in temperature will certainly cause some amount of difficulty. Or I'm thinking more of like the pre-monsoon heat and what that could do, what heat waves around that could do in terms of the human health even, or animal health. But I think possibly this, if I don't know if CGIAR is doing this, I think it would be valuable research to see if some of these systems, adaptive systems based on local knowledge, actually have a say in reducing the impact of increasing temperatures.
Great. Next, we have a question from Franco Casellato. Franco, yep, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay, hi. Of course, I'm not an expert, so I'm just listening out of curiosity, because I'm very sensitive about this topic, this issue. My question was looking at the charts, and I saw, I might be wrong, but I saw a peak in the 50s, and I was wondering what that peak was caused by from.
Mm-hmm. The peak in rainfall in the 50s in the Sahel, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I don't want to make this too long, but so I kind of gave you an argument for what the human impact on the surface temperature of the oceans and rainfall in the Sahel was. But usually when we know that climate is much more than that. It's not just rote response to human forcing. There's a lot of variability that is natural. And so before we got to this point of arguing that there may be some element of actually human influence, everybody was thinking that's what we were seeing in the Sahel, a lot of natural variability on multi-decadal timescales. And so in fact that peak in the 50s and 60s that is not reproduced in these climate models is making me think that that's where we should look for this element of natural variability, connecting long-term time scale, like decadal, multi-decadal time scales in the ocean with rainfall across the Sahel. So yeah, the ocean, the climate varies on all time scales, including these decadal time scales, and so something like a warmer North Atlantic or not as warm global tropics, or I would look for
Thank you.
That kind of explanation. Yeah. You're welcome.
Great. Thank you, Alessandra. Next we have Akemi Yonemura, who worked at UNESCO in Dakar. Akemi, the floor is yours. So the question is actually in the chat box as well. So I'm happy to read it as well. I worked in the Sahel from 2013 to 2019 for UNESCO Dakar, closely working with other UN agencies on climate change, and currently working for higher education in UNESCO Paris. We are interested in the impact of COVID-19 on your argument, i.e. human activities, air traffic, etc., influence on climate change. I have seen the air quality improvement compared 2019 and 2020. If so, what do you think we should be preparing for the coming years in the education sector, particularly higher education?
That's a great question. I really love this thinking about, I mean, it'd be, in my thinking, really, addressing climate change could really, I mean, but this is really wishful thinking of the utopia really at the highest level, is that to understand climate change and the impacts and consequences, you really need to be interdisciplinary. You can't just be studying physics and so if we could start going in that direction really in higher education, of really thinking what is the basic knowledge, what are elements of basic knowledge in different fields that the next generation should really have, a little bit of physics or maybe a little bit of understanding how things are modeled or things are measured, but also human societal aspects of how we build, how people understand the political science side of things. So beyond this emergency, it would really be a rethink of higher education that goes towards the interdisciplinary and that tries to tie together some building blocks that are maybe common to more disciplines, but also some understanding of the different perspectives that the disciplines bring.
Great.
Excuse me, can I say something? I'm sorry, I didn't figure out how to unmute. And now
I see. I'm so sorry. You go ahead. Please go ahead.
Thank you for reading the question. My major question is a COVID-19 impact. Right now, the air travel is reduced. And then I saw an article that air quality has changed just in a short period of time. And then I assume this will continue for some time. So do you think it will have an impact on climate change study that you're doing? If that's the case, maybe less people will travel, and then we will rely more on this kind of virtual meetings and other forms of job. So maybe we should be preparing education and training for a different type of jobs, and then what is the impact? And then as a climate scientist, how do you see this COVID-19? And do you think there's an influence in a long term?
I think it will be an interesting test of, as you say, how much do different human activities contribute to emissions. I don't see that emissions will go down in a really substantial way, but we will see next year when we look at the records, that are measured on Mauna Loa, how much emissions went down. But if it's COVID, it's going to be a blip. Hopefully, it's not going to last so long that it could have any significant impact on emissions themselves. I don't think, so it'll be more like a volcanic eruption in terms of climatic impact, but not if not. Of course, there are, all the benefits of less pollution and less CO2 emissions. I think it'll be an interesting learning experience to see to what extent this kind of restraining and reducing our global economy, constraining our global economy, what it can do in terms of CO2 emissions. We'll be able to measure it in a year or so, and then argue for how much more would we need to do if we were really shifting. We're serious about shifting to a post fossil fuel world.
Great. Next, we have a question from Gregory Mann.
Hi, I had this in the chat privately to Manuel, but hi, Ali, thanks for the talk.
Hi.
I wonder if you could give any thoughts about the future viability of pastoralism in particular in the region, and how and whether pastoralists have played an active role in climate change mitigation efforts recently. Because a lot of what you were talking about in terms of adopted techniques seem to be practiced perhaps by farmers or by people in mixed economic strategies.
Yeah, you know exactly who you should be talking to, Greg. You shouldn't be asking me. You should be asking Lisa Nebier. In the short term, even in the short term of coping with climate variability, let's say on year-to-year timescales, what you're just saying is reflected in that also, in that right now there's a lot of activity around building climate services, making this information available for people who can take decisions based on knowing whether next season is, there's more or less likelihood that it's going to be good or bad. And pastoralists have been kind of relegated to the sides. There's no information even on this shorter timescales that's of use to pastoralists. But here, you're talking at longer term trends, and those are more than just the climate, right? Yeah. Maybe there's some other people online who would like to answer that. So if you're thinking, I guess you would have to, that would really be a place where you would have to put together climate with the economics and the demography of the region to really understand what spaces are still available or should be safeguarded for pastoralists if you want them to maintain this kind of livelihood system.
Well, maybe it's a question for a future seminar. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. Next, we've got a question from Yusuf Caruso. I'll unmute you. Yusuf, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Hi, yes, go ahead.
Hello, Ali. How are you?
Oh, I'm good. How are you, Yusuf?
Yeah, so my question was about, I missed the first part, about 20 minutes. So I was interested in your engagement with West African scientists that you've been for the last, 20 years. And I'm concerned about the trend now, with all the focus on the economic outcome of COVID-19, that research on climate might get pushed to the back, in a lot of the Sahelian countries. And that would mean losing information about what's happening, short of you flying in and saying and looking around, So I was wondering, are you aware of any trends right now for major projects in the region, in particular countries? You mentioned Ethiopia, so that interested me. But also Senegal, which has been, at the forefront for many years studying this, but I don't know what the current trend is, whether there's enough going on the ground so that they can engage with other scientists around the world and come up with solutions. I don't know. It's kind of an open-ended worry.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see whether we can actually, exploit this technology to actually engage more with scientists in Africa. I know, I don't know if, for example, this year, the Climate Outlook Forum for the Sudano-Sahelian region is happening online. And so in principle, it could be a great opportunity for everybody actually for actually broadening the participation, because it's online. Anybody from anywhere who's interested could really participate. If flying to Niamey wasn't as appealing to you last year, then maybe now just, checking in on Zoom. So in principle, I think it would be, maybe that's something that we should be more explicit about and really try and take advantage of and make these connections and try to build these networks this way. Because otherwise, as you were saying, even before COVID, now nobody's gonna want to go and do any research in Mali, Burkina Faso. They're all X'd on, and it's really become difficult to participate in and just go to have the opportunity to go to these conferences that I've enjoyed so much attending in the past 20 years. Yeah, maybe we should be more determinate about maintaining some of these links and building on them.
Okay, thanks.
In these different ways. Thank you.
As a librarian, I keep tracking these things and looking for the research results and trying to help other people find them. So thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf.
We have one last question from Sophie Brichetti. I'm afraid that she's left, but I have her question here, and if you're happy with that, I will read it to you. So looking at security and climate change, several governments of developed countries have increasingly talked about a new type of migrants, the climate change, between inverted commas, migrants, often citing the Sahel as a region many of them will be from. What is your view on this in the medium to longer term? Will we see a significant rise in migrants from the Sahel as they're trying to escape the effects of climate change on the region? If so, will there be a common migration pattern for climate change migrants from the Sahel? Are they more likely to emigrate all the way to Europe, or will they tend to migrate within their country or to neighboring ones? So big.
Thank you for this,
here, yes.
Emmanuel. This was the question that I was hoping some of the people who were supposed to be online would be able to answer, because I try to stay away from this issue as much as I can. But what I can say is that I actually, kind of getting in tune with presenting this this discussion today. I was rereading some of this. I was rereading this West African long-term perspective study, which is a lot about the demography, actually, and about the fact that one of the ways that the region tries to maintain some equilibrium is precisely by allowing people to move around. And so having more of that regional migration and having places that, a lot of migration from rural to urban, but also across countries from, certain points that are more like, points of greater economic activity or more attractive in those terms. And so there's a lot of work that shows that there's a lot more migration within the region than migration from the region to Europe or elsewhere. That said, I guess the Sahel is one part of this bigger West African region, and so the question of how the Sahel specifically adapts or uses migration to other parts of the region, coastal, or is a question. I don't know if I'm allowed to call on people who study migration here on this list. Anybody who wants to speak up on this issue of it's a very contentious issue, because in the press in recent years it has been just framed so simply as saying, okay, there's a drought, then people will leave and they will all get on a boat and go to try to cross the Mediterranean. It's very simplistic that way.
Can I say something about migration?
Yes, please.
Please go.
Okay, so the IOM has done a lot of work on migration, IOM, and also UNHCR, UNOWAS, UN agency.
Mm-hmm.
And they have done a study about migration and conflict. But I also wanted to see more on the migration and climate change relationship. So that part I haven't seen a lot. So that's why I wanted to learn from you.
I think, I can cite some old work from the 80s that shows that there was a lot of, like during these droughts, there was a lot of regional migration. But it was kind of circular, from what I recall. It didn't really extend abroad. That said, it's not easy in Norway. Typically, if you ask people why they migrated, they may have a different narrative, or different person asking them. Or I have very close friends from Senegal in Italy who migrated in 1984, which was the year of the drought. So I mean, is that why they migrated, or why people migrate? Yeah.
I think most of the migration is within the region, as you mentioned, and most of the migration is because of an economic reason. And then other thing is happening is trafficking. People who are crossing the Mediterranean, it's really related to trafficking as well.
Susanna, who is one who knows a lot more about this, and so she's been listening while I say stupid things, has a comment in the chat box that refers to a publication. But yeah, I agree with you, Akemi, what you were just saying now. So if you could think about building you know, there too an indirect chain of effects, such that maybe if drought affects agriculture and affects the economy and affects, and it's a combination of causes that then really pushes people out, and
I can comment if there's time.
Yes, please.
I mean, it's just a pity that Alex de Chervenin has to leave, because he knows a lot more about this and is currently involved in an NSF Converge project, specifically looking into environmental migration in West Africa, including the Sahel. I suggested the World Bank report, because even when it's looking into internal migration, I think that provides a lot of tips about how to include climate and environment within the drivers of migration. And I think that what Akemi has said is very true. It's never simple, and migration is complex always, and including climate, it means that you need to look at a lot of mediation, facilitator constraints about how exactly the climate driver could affect migration in the end. And there's a lot that has to do with, as you said, livelihood, to be in urban or rural resident. So I think that that's the important thing to consider. It's never simple, and it's never the direct impact on that. And the regional migration is very important. That's I think is critical to consider. How people could move within the region is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna.
Great. If there are no more questions, then I mean, it remains for me to really thank Alessandra for enlightening us today, and also looking at an issue which is really central to many different disciplines, and bringing your own knowledge, your own scientific knowledge to this issue. Which I think was extremely helpful and enlightening. And I'll pass on to Richard to say a few closing remarks before we close.
I wish to thank you all very much, and particularly Alessandra. I think it was a very, very interesting and stimulating presentation. I was so glad to see so many friends from over Atlantic to join the discussion. I'm particularly sensitive to the idea of Alessandra to integrate research, interdisciplinary research and public policy, I would say bottom up from the ground. And the kind of work that you have done and conducted in your career is very exemplar to this. I think we should consider the ways we could develop, institutionalize and develop this kind of research across our institutions in a near future. But probably this will deserve much more discussion and further discussion in the coming weeks and coming months for the next coming seminars from Alliance. Emmanuel, maybe do we have another meeting scheduled with one of these Alliance seminars so far, or not yet?
So we don't have a date yet, but we will be continuing in our series of talks in collaboration with Sciences Po, with Columbia, with Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne, and with École Polytechnique. And so you will be receiving the invitation for our next talk, which I hope will take place next month, or in early June at the latest. But I'm really grateful to all of you, and it's great to be partnering with AIRE and Sciences Po in bringing you Alessandra today. And keep the comments going if you have, after following further questions. Please don't hesitate to either email me or Alessandra or Richard, and we'll be very pleased and excited to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. I just wanted to mention, Emmanuel, I think you were recording it, right? So if people,
I am,
well,
yes,
I guess that will be
have said that. Yes, thank you for reminding me, Alessandra. So I will be sending the recording to everyone who participated today, so that it is available to you, and then links to some of the websites also that you quoted, Alessandra, will also make that available to people who participated in this seminar.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy the day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.